Hello and welcome to the Business Talk podcast. I am your host Deepak. Let us extend a warm welcome to Professor Ioannis Ioannou as he joins us on our podcast. Professor Ioannis is an associate professor of strategy and entrepreneurship at London Business School and is a prominent scholar in the field of strategy with a research focus on sustainability and corporate social responsibility. His work explores how modern businesses contribute to building a sustainable future, examining both the motivations and impact of corporate actions in this space. Professor Ioannou graduated with a great praise from Yale University, majority in economics and mathematics, and holds a Ph.D. in business economics from Harvard University and the Harvard Business School. In this episode, Professor Ioannis Ioannou will share valuable insights from his research, navigating the sustainability disruption, taking stock, and looking ahead. Professor Ioannis, it is truly a pleasure to have you with us today.
Deepak, thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure and a privilege, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you, Professor. Professor, your research highlights a gap in the strategy field where environmental and social performance are often treated separately from financial performance. Could you elaborate on how this gap affects our understanding of strategic management in the age of sustainability?
Yes, of course. Thank you. That's a great question to start. I think that when we look at the strategy as a field, especially for the last 50 or so years, what is really striking is that, of course, we care about corporate profitability. We will care to understand what is it that drives performance heterogeneity across companies and across time and across industries and so on. We need to understand, in other words, the sources of competitive advantage. But I think at a time and a place where we face the crisis by climate change, the collapse of biodiversity, the plastics pollution, the acidification of the oceans. And at the same time, in addition to the environmental issues, we face so many other social issues. We see social fabric collapsing in some countries around the world with huge implications on the political system. We see the marginalization of several communities. We see marginalization by and discrimination by gender, by race, by sexual orientation. In other words, there's no question that the world has fundamentally changed. And in fact, some folks actually call this the polycrisis. In other words, the context in which businesses operate has fundamentally changed. And therefore, my view is that the way we look at strategy also needs to fundamentally change. And why is that the case? Well, what is strategy? Strategy is about running not only successful but thriving businesses. But how could businesses thrive by ignoring the environmental and social context in which they operate and focus unidimensionally only on profit? That is just illogical. Now, I need to note here that I'm not arguing for replacing profit for environmental and social performance. That would be easy. The question we're asking here is, how are you making that profit? Who are you imposing costs on while you're making that profit? And basically, we're going through a period where society says it's not acceptable to waste abused resources while you produce profit. It's not acceptable to produce that profit without taking into consideration the impact that you have on the world. And in many ways, if we're being honest with ourselves, the impact has been negative. If it hadn't been negative, we wouldn't have a climate change problem today. We wouldn't have a biodiversity problem today. So the short version of the answer is that we need to rethink what we call strategy and to what objectives. And you see, I think that sustainability and environmental and social issues change both sides of the equation. First of all, how we manage businesses. In other words, how we help businesses develop strategies that are a best fit for a competitive landscape that is affected profoundly by environmental and social issues. So that's the input side. But we also need to think about the output side. In other words, profit alone is no longer enough because we need to understand the impacts and, in fact, the contributions that businesses can make on environmental and social issues. And again, I emphasize in addition to profitability, not instead of profitability. So effectively, the problem is just the strategic problem is simply becoming a lot more complex and complicated going forward.
You mentioned that traditional strategic frameworks focus heavily on financial metrics. So, how do you see the evolution of strategy shifting in response to the growing emphasis on sustainability?
So if I go back to this kind of understanding that I just shared with you in terms of the inputs and the outputs, I think the emphasis will shift, and it's already shifting in two broad and specific broad ways, but and with respect to the inputs and the outputs. So the first one is we pay a lot more attention now in terms of what we broadly call non-market strategy. In other words, what is it that companies do, not only in the financial / economic domain, but also in the environmental and social domain, right? In other words, their strategies, their initiatives, their targets, all of those inputs. So our strategy definition ought to broaden, right, to talk about not only the market but also the non-market aspects. And there's many colleagues around the world that also integrate the political, right, because ultimately, especially when we talk about huge organizations, huge companies around the world, we do know that they are political actors, right? Look at, for instance, the recent acquisition of what used to be Twitter by X by Elon Musk, right? It used to be kind of the public space of the world and now became the gutter of the alt-right used for political purposes. So the inputs are very important in that respect. So we have to broaden the dimensions that we consider as we devise strategy. And also, right, we in especially in academic papers and academic work, always what we call the dependent variable. In other words, the outcome that we were interested in, as I mentioned earlier, was of course profitability, but we now see well, the availability of data helps a lot in that. We also now see more and more work that comes out and asks even broader questions. Of course, we want to understand the financial performance, but we also want to consider what is the impact on the broader corporate social performance, right? And I think, by the way, this is a consistent in terms of, for instance, if you think about the European regulation on disclosure, what we know as CSRD, that is going to force companies to disclose not only the risks that they face, but the risks that they also create for the world. That has a parallel in strategy work. In other words, of course, we want to understand how environmental and social challenges affect the business, both in terms of risks as well as opportunities. But effectively, the world and regulators are asking us, well, that's only half of the story. It's not just about you. It's also about society and the environment. We ought to know, and you need to consider, businesses, not only the risks and opportunities for you, but also the negative and positive potential impacts that you as a business have on the world. And therefore, in terms of more academic terms, the dependent variable could well be, and I hope it will be, not only the corporate social performance of a business, but also macro level variable. So, for instance, when companies set all of these carbon reduction targets and net zero emissions, well, can we actually trace a reduction in carbon emissions in the real world? Right? And more systemic issues. I'll give you another example, right? Many companies support, rightly so, in my view, diversity and inclusion initiatives. And for instance, they try to include more women on their boards. That's great. But the question is, does that solve the systemic issue of creating more opportunities for women to be on boards? And a lot of the times the answer is no, because what happens is that you have a limited pool of women that suddenly find themselves stretching thin in terms of belonging to many boards, as opposed to solve that doesn't solve the systemic issue. That doesn't mean that women that were not on boards suddenly are going to start getting the opportunities that they deserve. The systemic issue is, well, creating those opportunities. So businesses, just by increasing their own board, do not the diversity in our own board does not necessarily solve the underlying issue. So the short answer again to your question is that on the input side, we need to consider factors beyond economic and financial as they drive decision making, and therefore better position the firms in the socio-environmental and political context in which they operate. And on the outcome side, we need to care not only about financial performance, about own social performance, but also about real environmental and social impacts of business.
Very insightful. Professor, in your work, you explore the concept of extending the boundaries of the strategy field. What does this extended definition of strategy look like, and why is it necessary for the future of corporate management?
So precisely, the definition, Deepak, is exactly what I described. So we need to have a strategy definition that when it comes to the inputs that we take in the decision process, we need to broaden the context to the environmental, the social, and arguably the political domain as well. And I'm not saying nobody's doing this, right? There's plenty of work out there already. But fundamentally, we kind of need to revisit strategy, I think, in my view, and set those foundations because it has implications. I'll give you an example, right? In many business schools around the world, how do we teach strategy? We have a core strategy course, right, that covers the fundamentals. And then if you want to do sustainability or ESG or social responsibility, you'll have to take an elective. That's an add-on. Well, that's problematic. It's kind of saying, take care of the financials and then the other ones is an optional extra. That's wrong. That's profoundly wrong for the world that we are in. So when I say extending the definition, it means that even in core strategy courses, right, environmental, social, and political and governance issues should be already integrated in terms of how do we teach our students to run businesses. And the same definition extension applies on the outcome side. Of course, we want them to run thriving business. And by the way, because I know there is a group of folks that have an aversion to profits. I am not one of those, right? Because I think even philosophically, profit is essential. And let me give you my short philosophy story here. Look, what is it that companies do at the end of the day? Companies, at the end of the day, have two capabilities that other institutions do not have: to innovate solutions, whether they're products or services, to meet those customer needs, right? And the second important capability that they have is to scale up those solutions effectively, efficiently, and profitably. It is only profitability that allows for the scaling up of those solutions. There aren't any other institutions in the world that can do that. Okay, now look at sustainability challenges. What do we need to solve the world's environmental and social issues? Well, we need many things, but one important critical element is what? Innovative solutions, in other words, innovative products and services that also need to be scaled up very quickly. Therefore, what does that mean? For me at least, it means that we need profitable, healthy, thriving businesses with the ability to innovate solutions for these problems and scale them up, right? And in order to scale them up, they need to bring, products that are profitable, that meet customer needs, and also speak to a bigger problem. So that's what I mean typically when we talk about extending the definition in the inputs, but also looking at the outputs of business, not only in the unidimension of profit, but perhaps a profit as a means, a very effective means, by the way, that will keep shareholders very happy in the meantime, as we address systemic challenges that we face in the environmental and social domain.
You discuss the limitations of viewing environmental and social performance in isolation. What are the risks companies face by treating sustainability as a separate issue from their broader strategic goals?
Yeah, so there's two challenges here. So first of all, there are some folks that argue that ESG or environmental and social issues should not be looked at together because we're putting too many diverse issues in one bucket, and therefore it's better to break it down. ESG is not. I fundamentally disagree with this view. And for me, the starting point is science, right? Look at the planetary boundaries framework. Why did Professor Johann Rockström and his team sit down and thought about the planetary boundaries framework? Precisely because, for instance, environmental issues are not independent. there are feedback loops. For instance, worsening of climate change may lead to faster decline in biodiversity. And a faster decline in biodiversity means that climate change can get worse because, for instance, we know when the biodiversity collapses, when forests die, or when there's deforestation, we cannot absorb enough carbon, right? So, and there's so many other dimensions that the planetary frameworks covers, from the ozone layer to the plastics pollution to the acidification of the ocean. So, if science is telling us there's potential negative feedback loops, and therefore you ought to be looking at these issues together, why would we come in the business world and say, oh, I'm going to look environmental in isolation, and I'm going to look at the climate in isolation? It kind of, now, don't get me wrong, not all businesses are going to be able to address all issues, right? That's impossible. But urging them to see the issues only in isolation is dangerous and goes against the underlying science, in my view. Now, then we come to the issue of social. Well, actually, a latest iteration of the planetary boundaries framework says it's not just about staying within the boundaries, it's also about achieving a just transition towards remaining within the planetary boundaries, right? So in other words, we need to understand the impacts on people, right? We already know, for instance, that the world's more marginalized communities or developing countries are experiencing the most negative of impacts, and they have contributed the least historically to climate change, right? So there's a global injustice that is happening over there. So and this is in addition to, even within developed countries, if you look at disparities of impacts between, for example, lower income communities, particular racial and ethnic groups, and so on and so forth, still you can see that is a very uneven distribution of the negative impacts. So that's part of the story. You cannot just say I care about the climate change, but I don't care about how that affects local communities or marginalized groups. You cannot solve one problem without also considering the other, in my view, at least. Again, by the way, this integration is not only for businesses, it's also for governments and policymakers and regulators, because you cannot have, for instance, an environmental laws in isolation without understanding what impact will they have on society and on people, right? So I totally agree that for each of these dimensions, it is ideal that we develop depth, right? So we need to understand profoundly on its own climate change, biodiversity, social justice, racial justice, and so on and so forth. That I do not disagree that we need to develop depth and specialists, but that should not prevent us from also looking at those issues as part of a system that needs change, as opposed to looking at them in isolation. That's my view, at least. So that's when it comes to the ESG issues, and I think that based on everything we discussed, and given how I described the way that I think about environmental and social issues, the answer to the second part of the question about seeing them independent of strategic goals it's impossible, in my view, because if we agree that environmental and social issues are fundamentally shifting the competitive landscape, then how could you possibly set strategic goals without accounting how the strategic landscape is changing? I mean, think about it, right? I mean, this may vary across industries, but in some industries, customers are demanding more environmentally and socially responsible products and services. In other industries, it might be that investors are integrating environmental and social and governance issues in their investment decisions. Other industries are in the eye of the storm, and they face elevated levels of social activism by activists, by the likes of Just Stop Oil, Extinction Rebellion, Greenpeace, and so on and so forth, knocking at your door. Other organizations, think about what happened with Amazon, for instance, and their climate pledge. Other companies are filling it from their own employees, and not being sustainable or not being responsible affects their ability to attract and retain and engage human capital. And of course, the media is painting it, rightly so, putting a lot of attention into supply chains, especially those that extend deep into, developing countries more specifically. Think about textiles, for instance. Think about mining and extractives, for instance. So if you're a good CEO, right, even if you don't actually care about these issues, but you go to work on Monday morning, you have a lot of your on your plate. How everything that I just described are broadly environmental and social challenges. So how could you possibly set up strategic goals for a successful business without accounting for this or thinking about them independently? How could you think about them independently if these issues profoundly affect each and every one of your major stakeholders?
Professor, how can organizations balance short-term financial performance with long-term sustainability goals? And what role does leadership play in this transition?
Yeah, I think here I would say that there's two sustainability stories that one needs to keep in mind. And I always tell this to my students, right? I always say that half of the sustainability story is going to be a story about increasing costs. And that's the part that not many people are willing to talk about. And of course, there's the other part of the story, which is about opportunity. Now, when it comes to the cost side, effectively, what we're seeing around the world right now is a kind of a thinking that basically says it's time to pay the bill, right? In other words, for many years, we've been abusing, wasting, over extracting resources, over polluting, and so on and so forth. And now we're saying, well, we got to a point where that's no longer sustainable. We need to recognize these negative impacts, put a price tag on them. In other words, increase the cost, right? And the same applies, by the way, in supply chains. Yes, of course, it's going to be cheaper if somewhere deep in the supply chain you have children working in the mines under abysmal conditions. But are we willing to, accept that low cost at the cost of the social cost that imposed? So society, luckily, finally, is saying that's not acceptable. So clearly, not having children in your supply chain, actually paying attention to the health and safety conditions of your textile factories in Bangladesh and so on and so forth, is going to be more expensive. So what we're seeing is that the cost of doing business in most industries, it's the same with net zero, by the way, the cost of doing business is inevitably going up because the world is realizing that there are costs that are not priced in. This is very important. So for that part of the sustainability story, it's not a matter of trade-off between financial goals and sustainability goals. It's just a matter of understanding what is now considered the minimum that you need to do in an industry, in your industry. And that applies to every industry, right? For example, in some industries, think about commodities. How could you be trading or using commodities without buying commodities that have some type of certification, like fair trade or Rainforest Alliance, for instance, right? I'm not saying those certifications are perfect, but clearly they increase the bar of what is considered acceptable. So in that part of the business, it's not about making profit. It's an insurance-like protection. Because think about it, you certify your supply chain. That means you face a lower reputational risk of finding, modern slavery or forced labor in your supply chains and so on and so forth, right? You may sometimes when we talk about commodities and you reduce the use of fertilizer and chemicals, you might have higher yields and higher quality and so on and so forth. So on that part of the sustainability story, it's not a matter of trade-off. It's a matter of understanding that the world deems, rightly so, some of those prior practices as unacceptable, and it's pricing in the cost. So for you as a business, it's a question of you have the choice, right? You'll sit back and wait for regulation to do it, or you're going to be more proactive and think about your policies and practices. So by the time the cost actually starts going up, you're prepared for it. I'll give you an example. We talk about carbon tax. Well, guess who's going to be better positioned to deal with a carbon tax? Well, the companies that invest earlier in decarbonization. I mean, this is so obvious, right? So the companies that understand and distinguish between what is going to be the cost of doing business and start making those investments today, they will be better positioned to deal with those costs when they ultimately and eventually will go up. Because if policies don't increase them, Mother Nature will, right? And we have already seen multi-billion-dollar damages, for instance, and disruptions caused by natural disasters that are becoming more frequent and more intense, right? So that's on the costs, sorry, on the cost side. And in fact, I wouldn't call it cost, because if you follow and you agree with my thinking, that only means that on that part of the story, you ought to make investments in order to be better positioned of what was going to be considered the baseline going forward. And of course, there's the easiest side, which is the upside, right? As we discussed earlier, these environmental and social challenges are in need of innovative solutions. Think about solar panels, for instance. Think about wind energy. Think about electric vehicles. All of those are growth opportunities for companies. So, for as long as companies are innovative, they understand the challenge, they understand the market that these challenges and these are opening, and they convert those opportunities, then for in that part of the story, then it is synergistic. Now, let's be honest though, right? It's not going to be synergistic for all companies. If you invent a green product that is so expensive that nobody can buy, and on top of that, you did not find a marketing or a pricing strategy to enter, then you're not a sustainable business, right? You haven't, because you're still a business. You still need to innovate in a way that brings a product or a service to the price performance sort of ratio that resonates with the consumers. If you don't do that, then I'm sorry, you might have a green product, but you don't have a green business. Those two things, those are very different things, right? So there will be challenges along the way, because sometimes these environmental and social issues require a new type of innovation. Companies are not used to thinking about environmental impacts, let alone solving environmental impacts, right? So it's going to take some time, and we need to be prepared for a world in which many of them will also fail. Because we know, I mean, think about it, the corporate graveyard is packed with once iconic brands that failed to transition technological disruptions in the past. Sears, Kodak, Polaroid, Blockbuster, Lehman Brothers, the list is endless. So you need to be prepared in a world where there will be competition, there will be failed innovation attempts, and there will be companies that will fail to transition, and that's part of the process.
What are some of the practical implications of your research for corporate leaders who are trying to navigate the disruption brought about by sustainability concerns?
Yeah, that's a great question. So exactly because the sustainability challenge is such a broad kind of topic, it touches upon everything, right? From geopolitics to environmental and social issues to actual strategy. I have developed a framework, a tentative framework, which I call the 6 elements of a sustainable business model. So I've been able to translate my research into a model, a framework that executives can use, and can use it from multiple perspectives, right? So for instance, if you're a board member and you need to oversee, monitor, or coach the executives in order to build a sustainable business, what are the dimensions that you should be looking for? If you are the executive and you want to build a sustainable business, what are the elements, the pillars that would allow you to do so? If you are in services or a consultant and you want to advise your customers, your clients in terms of how to do this, what are those elements? And similarly, especially perhaps if you are in the financial industry and you say, well, I want to invest in sustainable business, well, clearly your ESG data set is not going to be enough. You need to ask more profound questions. So this is another reason why I developed this element. It would take a long time to describe the whole thing, but what I would say is that the 6 elements are basically the core principle of this synergistic integration between financial and social environmental performance that we discussed earlier. Understanding this duality of the challenge. Again, this is the story of the cost versus the upside of sustainability. Then, as every strategy, you need to understand, map out, and address the trade-offs that sustainability goals create, right? So those are the core principle, the duality of the story, and the resulting trade-offs are basically on the strategy design side. And in my model, I go deeply into each one of them and describe how we can make strategic choices with each one, so we achieve that alignment, at least on the strategy design. And then the other 3 pertain to implementation. So more specifically, in order to implement that kind of strategy, first of all, you need to also understand the process. In other words, where does the rubber meet the road? How is it that sustainability will actually create that value that we're talking about? Is it through innovation? Is it through human capital? Is it through better access to finance? Is it through the social license to operate? What exactly is it, that the process through which you're going to achieve that? And what is the phased process that you have in stock and you're implementing in order to address the trade-offs that we talked about earlier? Then process is not enough. You also need a structure. What I say that you need to build a house of sustainability. So a lot of folks talk about this proverbial corporate DNA that's going to include sustainability. So what is that, right? So in my framework, when I talk about structure, I talk about corporate governance, the time horizon for decision making, stakeholder engagement, and the broader transparency and accountability strategies that a company adopts in order to be more sustainable. Right. And last but not least, the sixth element, as you mentioned in your question as well, it's of course leadership, because I think there's something very important and very different when we talk about leadership in the context of sustainability. I think in the context of sustainability, if you're going to work in the morning as a leader and you say, I'm going to run this business with a purpose. I'm going to run this business with positive impact. I'm going to run this business in a way that is a thriving business and has a positive impact in the world. Well, guess what? You need to be authentic about it, right? You need to be that purpose. You need to live that purpose, because otherwise your employees, the world, the stakeholders are going to see through this, right? And I think what I described there is that this is, it's a process of cultural management. It's a process of cultural change for the organization. I'll give you an example. If you are a leader that goes to work on Monday morning and say, "Oh, I want to make this business digital," well, most people at least are not going to have feelings or emotions or a moral compass against becoming digital. On average, they would agree. They might decide, at which pace are you going to do this? How much is it going to cost? But few would doubt that making a business digital is what you need to be doing these days, right? However, if you go to your business in the morning and you say, we need to be inclusive, we need to be positive, we need to have environmental impact, we need to be a force for good, well, guess what? Of course, people are going to have feelings and emotions and strong reactions and values and norms and moral attitudes towards this objective. That's a different level of management as a leader, in my view. And those are problems that arguably are not as acute in other change domains, like digital, for instance, as they are in sustainability. And that's why the role of leadership is so important. So that's my 6-element model that I usually teach, that I convey my online course at London Business School on sustainability leadership, on the executive courses that I do, but also that's typically what's at the core of when I give keynote speeches or when I work with boards or member of a boards in some cases. That's kind of more structured thinking that I try to bring to the table in order to answer precisely the question of how do we reconcile those different aspects of strategy in organizations.
Professor Ioannis, my last question. Looking ahead, what are the key areas for future research in sustainability and strategy that you think will shape the next phase of corporate strategy? And what advice would you give to companies that are just beginning to integrate sustainability into their strategic planning process?
So when it comes to research, I think there are so much more that we can do, right? I mean, the work on corporate social responsibility started some time ago, but at some point it took off, and it's going through cycles, I think. I mean, I've been at London Business School for going on 15 years now, and I've seen it basically being a topic that was peripheral to then becoming mainstream and now becoming contested. And unfortunately became a bit of a toxic space where you have both attacks from within and from outside academia, right? So for instance, sometimes on the integrity of the experts or the integrity of past work and so on and so forth. I'm very saddened to see academia take that route, because it's science. We always built or disprove. That's fine. That's what science is all about, right? But we should be doing it in a positive way, in a way that says, at the time of the original work, this was the best in class, and now we have more data. We have better methods. We have better theory. We have better understanding. So, my view going forward in research, I hope that, although I'm not too optimistic about it, but I do hope that we're going to go back into a world where we're scientists as opposed to self-serving individuals that attack others or say controversial things or contrarian things in order to, personal fame sometimes, right? And satisfaction and or envy, in fact, as opposed to really pushing the envelope forward when it comes to the underlying science of it. And we also, I think, research in sustainability ought to understand that this is not physics. We're not going to run those kinds of experiments. We need to understand that we're doing social science, and some of the findings that we make may be particular to an industry, to a time period, to a particular context. And therefore, we need to learn as we go along and be open to learning, because we will never find the equivalent of the laws of physics in social science, right? And we need to be very clear about that. Particular topics, I think the space is full of potential topics. We need to understand more at the intersection of sustainability and corporate strategy as opposed to business unit strategy. We need to understand more about how sustainability works and function in private markets and family businesses as opposed to only the public corporations. There's a huge amount of work that ought to be done in areas where we don't yet have data. So, for instance, developing countries, right, where the data is perhaps not as good as in the developed countries, kind of that have so many information intermediaries. We also need to, although we do know that the world's largest companies are the ones that are going to have the most impact, I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done in understanding SMEs and the role that they play, both in terms of environmental, but also in terms of social issues, and as part of the global supply chains of these larger corporations. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in order to understand the antecedents and consequences of greenwashing, which we have seen a lot around the world. What drives firms to do that? What are the consequences? And then from there, backward engineer and say, what sort of laws and regulations do we need? What policies do we need in order to prevent greenwashing from happening? I mean, I could go on and on and on. There's so many issues. The other one that I feel very strongly about, and we briefly touched upon it earlier, it's this idea of sustainable innovation. In other words, is innovation in the context of sustainability, in the context of integrating environmental and social issues, different than traditional notions of innovation? If so, in what ways? And how can we drive better sustainable innovation? And what are the consequences of doing so at the level of businesses? And from there, backward engineer and say, well, what are the consequences for policy in terms of how we promote sustainable innovation and curb greenwashing? So those are just some of the areas. I hope I've given you enough. There's just so much that can be done in research as long as we all come together and with integrity and with a genuine intention to understand these topics, collaborate with each other, and to stop undermining or attacking each other for mostly political or ideological reasons.
Listeners, thank you for joining us today's episode with Professor Ioannis Ioannou, where he shared invaluable insights from his research, navigating the sustainability disruption, taking stock, and looking ahead. Professor Ioannis, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast. Thank you for your invaluable contributions.
Thank you very much, Deepak. Thoroughly enjoy our conversations. Thank you very much for having me. Great questions.
Thank you.